The sound of the lock sliding shut was sharper than any insult, sharper even than the words that came before it. My own son Lowell looked at me with that cold, businesslike stare he'd inherited from his mother's side, and he said, "You need to cool off, Dad. 4 days. Maybe then you'll stop meddling in things that don't concern you." Then the door slammed, and I was left staring at the peeling wallpaper of the little back room like some tenant who'd missed the rent. It wasn't just any room. This used to be my sanctuary. I'd tied my fishing flies at that little desk by the crooked window. Ruth, God rest her soul, had read her magazines in that armchair before it collapsed under its own springs. Every crack in the floorboard was a memory, every shadow on the wall a whisper from years I thought meant something. And now, those same walls had become my prison bars. I tried the knob first. Locked solid. I rattled it until the brass shook in its socket, but it only made Lowell shout through the wood, "Save your energy, old man." I banged on the door with my fist until the skin of my knuckles went red. No answer. Just footsteps retreating down the hallway, growing fainter with each step, as if he couldn't stand the sound of me resisting. I sat down heavily on the bed, the mattress groaning beneath me, and stared at Ruth's old ceramic duck still perched on the dresser. She'd bought it at a garage sale 30 years ago, and I'd always hated the way it stared. But that night, in the silence, I almost laughed. That silly duck was the only company I had left. The hours crawled by. The light through the window dimmed, then disappeared, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the house's old pipes and the faint smell of cedar from the closet. My throat was dry, my stomach empty, but worse than that was the humiliation. A man lives his whole life building respect, raising children, keeping roofs over heads, and then one day his own son locks him in a room like a misbehaving dog. I whispered to the empty air, "Ruth, if you could see this," and my voice cracked. My son thought he'd broken me, but what he didn't know was that those 4 days would give me more than misery, they'd give me clarity. Because in that locked room I began planning something that would shake his world to the core. You won't believe the lengths I was willing to go. The second day was when pride turned sour and comedy began to creep into the corners of my misery. At sunrise, I tried to make a stand quite literally. I dragged the old armchair across the floor and rammed it into the door, hoping to splinter the frame. The chair gave way first. The back snapped clean off, and I tumbled backward in a heap, my hip bruised and my dignity limping. Somewhere beyond the door, I heard Claire's laugh, muffled, like she was covering her mouth with her sleeve. My daughter-in-law found amusement in watching me fail. Well, let her laugh, I'd remember that. They fed me like a prisoner, too. A plate shoved through with a stale sandwich one time, cold beans another. I stared at the bread and muttered, "I fought in 2 winters colder than this food." Then, out of spite, I bit into it with exaggerated gusto, chewing so loudly the ceramic duck seemed scandalized. But the silence. Oh, the silence was the hardest part. When you're alone with nothing but your own thoughts, they start to play tricks. I caught myself talking to Ruth's duck like it was a cellmate. "What do you think, Rufus?" Yes, I'd named it Rufus by then. "Should I break the window and crawl out? Or sit here and starve until Lowell remembers who built this house with his bare hands?" Rufus, of course, didn't answer. He just stared, same as always. But at least he didn't tell me to cool off. By the evening, I realized something strange. I wasn't entirely broken. Angry? Yes. Betrayed? Absolutely. But there was a spark of humor in the absurdity of it all. Imagine it, a 74-year-old man locked in a room by the very boy he once taught to tie his shoes. It was pitiful, almost laughable. And somehow, that laughter kept me from sinking. Still, beneath the jokes and the muttering, something sharper was forming. Every scrap of food, every hour of silence, every chuckle from beyond the door, it all added weight to a scale in my mind. And when that scale tipped, I promised myself, the crash would echo louder than any lock. Because what they didn't realize was that I'd stopped feeling like a victim. I was already beginning to feel like a man plotting his escape and his revenge. By the 3rd day, my body had grown weak, but my mind, oh, my mind was sprinting like a young colt. Hunger sharpened my thoughts, made them almost too bright to look at. Every creak of the house became a memory. every shadow a reflection. I remembered Lowell as a boy, climbing onto my shoulders to watch the fireworks on the 4th of July, his small hands gripping my ears like reins. And now, those same hands had turned a key to lock me away. The sting of betrayal cut deeper than the emptiness in my stomach. But here's where it turned almost ridiculous. In my desperation for water, I noticed a forgotten pitcher on the windowsill, crusted with dust. I shook it like it was some ancient relic. Out came 3 pathetic drops, landing on my tongue with the drama of a waterfall in the desert. I actually bowed to the pitcher like it was a sacred chalice. Rufus the duck was watching, of course, and I told him, "Don't look at me like that. A man does what he must." And then came the moment I'll never forget. Claire, perhaps out of guilt or sheer arrogance, cracked the door just enough to slide in a tray of soup. It was cold, watery, with a film of fat floating on top. I sniffed it and said loudly, "Oh, good. Gourmet cuisine. Straight from the kitchens of Paris." I slurped theatrically, making noises loud enough for the neighbors 3 houses down. I swear I heard Lowell mutter, "Old fool," as the door slammed shut again. Inside, I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. Not because it was funny, but because the whole situation had become too absurd not to laugh at. They thought they were breaking me, but in truth, they were giving me time. Time to remember. Time to plan. Time to grow sharper than I'd been in years. And that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I whispered to Rufus, "When I get out of here, they'll never see it coming." Because the joke was on them. Locking me in only meant I had 4 days to rehearse the grandest performance of my life. On the 4th morning, I woke up with sunlight stabbing through the crooked blinds, and for a moment, I thought I'd gone blind. My eyes watered, my head pounded, and I muttered, "So this is how a potato must feel in a cellar." I rolled off the bed and sat on the floor, back against the wall, legs stiff as fence posts. The absurdity of it all began to settle in an old man, once the master of this house, reduced to whispering strategies to a ceramic duck. That's when the memories turned from sweet to bitter. I thought about the mortgage payments I'd killed myself to make, the roof I'd fixed during a thunderstorm while Lowell slept soundly in his room, the Christmas mornings where I wrapped his gifts with shaking, calloused hands. All of it. All those decades of sacrifice. And he had the audacity to treat me like a trespasser in the very house my sweat had built. Rage filled me so hot I could almost smell it, like iron on fire. But then, as if the universe didn't want me to drown in my fury, comedy slipped back in. My stomach growled so loud it echoed. I clutched my belly and laughed. "Easy there, thunder gods. Don't bring the roof down." Even Rufus looked alarmed, his painted beak angled toward me as if to say, "You've officially lost it." That night, when they slid in another plate burnt toast, this time I shouted through the door, "You know, if you're going to keep me here, at least get me some strawberry jam. A man has standards." I heard a muffled snort, probably Claire trying not to laugh. Strange how small victories matter. If I could make her laugh, even against her will, then maybe I wasn't entirely powerless. But inside, I was done playing the fool. The hunger, the humiliation, the absurd theater of it all, it sharpened something in me. I didn't want their pity. I wanted my dignity back. And as I chewed that charcoal toast like it was steak from the Ritz, I made myself a vow. When that door finally opened, I wouldn't just walk free. I'd make sure this house, and everything in it, would never belong to Lowell again. When the lock finally clicked on the 4th evening, I didn't leap for the door. I sat still, breathing slow, as though I'd been expecting an audience. Lowell poked his head in with that same smirk he'd worn since he was 12 and thought he was too smart for curfews. "You alive, old man?" he muttered, looking around the room like he half hoped I wasn't. I smiled back, calm as a preacher at Sunday service. "Alive enough to outlive your cooking," I said, nodding at the plate of gray scrambled eggs he carried. Claire, standing behind him, snorted so hard she nearly dropped her wine glass. Lowell's face flushed, and for one glorious second, I saw a crack in his smug armor. The thing is, those days locked in gave me more than hunger. They gave me time to remember my own handwriting, because while they thought they'd broken me, I'd been planning. I had the papers drawn months before. The deed, the transfer, the clauses only I understood. I'd tucked them away in my desk, safe as secrets in a confessional. And Lowell, too lazy to open a drawer unless it had beer in it, had never bothered to check. As he set the eggs down on the desk, I said softly, "You know, Lowell, houses have memories. They don't forget whose hands built them, whose sweat sealed their beams." He rolled his eyes, but Claire leaned in slightly, like a cat catching the scent of something sharp. I took one dramatic bite of the rubbery eggs, chewed like a king at a banquet, and said, "I'll be leaving soon, but not empty-handed." Lowell laughed then, a short, barking laugh. "Leave? Where the hell would you go? You've got nowhere." And I laughed right back, full-bodied, so loud the ceramic duck rattled on the dresser. "Son," I said, wiping tears of mirth from my eyes, "you've just locked up the wrong man." "You'll see." Because what Lowell didn't know was that the house he thought he ruled already had a new owner, and that owner was ready to disappear with more than just memories. That night, I lay awake on the creaking bed, my belly full of eggs that tasted like shoe leather. The house groaned around me, as if it knew a secret was about to crawl out from its walls. I thought about Ruth again, how she used to say, "Eldridge, don't let anyone put you in a corner. Even me." She'd laugh when she said it, but I knew she meant it. And here I was, locked in a corner by my own flesh and blood. The anger in me had cooled into something sharper, something almost playful. I imagined Lowell swaggering around the house in his socks, bragging to Claire about how he'd finally taught Dad a lesson. I pictured him opening the fridge at midnight, only to find I'd replaced all the milk with prune juice. That image alone had me chuckling so hard the mattress springs squealed like an old fiddle. But the truth was bigger than pranks. While he strutted, I remembered every detail of the plan Ruth and I had whispered about years ago, back when Lowell first started treating me more like a burden than a father. We'd drawn it up in secret with the lawyer transferring the deed, placing little escape hatches in the will. Back then, it felt paranoid. Now, it felt like prophecy. The comedy of it all wasn't lost on me. Lowell thought he was keeping me under control by locking me in a room. In reality, he'd given me 4 uninterrupted days to polish my performance, to rehearse every word I'd deliver when I walked out free. The duck, Rufus, had become my audience. I even stood in front of him, bowing low, declaring, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you'll witness the greatest disappearing act since Houdini." If a ceramic bird could roll its eyes, Rufus surely would have. Still, beneath the humor, there was steel. My heart beat not with fear, but with anticipation. I wasn't going to stay caged like a mutt. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to vanish so completely, and take so much with me, that Lowell would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, wondering how the old fool slipped through his fingers. By the 5th morning, I was no longer just Eldridge, the locked-up old man. I was Eldridge, the actor rehearsing his final act. Every creak of the floor became a drum roll, every shadow in the corner a spotlight. I shuffled to the mirror above the dresser, stared at my worn face, and said out loud, "Ladies and gentlemen, behold the fool who raised a king and got a jailer instead." I bowed low, my knees cracking so loud I nearly toppled over. Rufus, sitting smug on the dresser, was my critic, and I swear his glassy eyes said, "Overacting again." Lowell opened the door briefly to toss in laundry, his dirty laundry, mind you, as if I'd wash it like some servant. I held up a pair of his socks with 2 fingers, wrinkling my nose. Ah yes, the royal offering. Nothing says respect for your father quite like gym socks marinated in defeat. Claire giggled in the hallway. Lowell snapped at her, "Don't encourage him." But I caught that flicker. Claire found me funnier locked up than Lowell was free. That, in its own way, was a victory. But humor was just my sugarcoating. Underneath, something raw pulsed. I remembered the nights Ruth and I would count pennies at the kitchen table, saving every dime so Lowell could go to college. He had dreamed of being a lawyer. Now he used laws of his own, making rules, orders, insults to cage me. My chest tightened. A man doesn't just feel betrayed. He feels hollow, as if someone scooped out the years he gave away for nothing. And yet, in that hollow, a strange freedom stirred. If Lowell could lock me up and laugh, then I owed him nothing. Not my house, not my presence, not even my anger. I imagined walking away, leaving him to sit at the same table where Ruth and I once sacrificed. Only now he'd have no one to sacrifice for him. That thought soothed me more than any soup they'd slipped through the door. I looked again at Rufus and whispered, "When curtain time comes, I won't just exit the stage. I'll take the spotlight with me." Because I realized something. Vanishing wasn't defeat, it was the sweetest kind of revenge. By the sixth day, my bitterness had ripened into something almost sweet. I caught myself humming an old jazz tune while folding the very laundry Lowell had shoved at me. Can you imagine? Locked up, fed burnt toast, treated like dead weight, and there I was, singing like Louis Armstrong. Maybe madness was setting in, or maybe it was clarity. Hard to tell the difference at my age. I made a game of it. Every sock I folded, I gave a name. "This one's Ruth," I said, tucking the cuff neatly. "This one's Rufus Jr." When I held up a pair of underpants, I grinned and said, "Well, this must be Lowell's pride, full of holes and never washed properly." I laughed so hard I had to sit down before I toppled. The absurdity of the situation made it almost bearable. But beneath the clowning, a storm brewed. The memories kept marching in, uninvited. Ruth and I, carrying boxes into this house the day we bought it, our hands raw, our spirits soaring. Lowell, barely 9, running up the staircase yelling, "This is mine!" And me smiling, never knowing those words would someday turn into chains around my wrists. That night, I pressed my ear to the door. I heard Lowell and Claire arguing in the kitchen. She whispered, "You can't keep him in there forever. People will start asking questions." Lowell hissed back, "He'll do what I say. He always has." I pulled away from the wood, my heart steady as stone. "Always has. Oh no, my boy. Not anymore." I sat on the bed, smoothed the blanket, and said to Rufus, "They think they're writing the script. But Rufus, you and I were about to steal the pen." Because while they argued over how to control me, I was already imagining the day they'd wake to find the house empty, the deed gone, and their power slipping through their fingers like sand. On the 7th morning, I woke to birdsong through the cracked window. Funny how free they sounded chirping without a care while I sat locked in a room built with my own 2 hands. I chuckled bitterly. "Even the pigeons in this town have more liberty than I do," I muttered, then raised a finger at Rufus the duck. "And don't smirk. You're no better. At least they can fly." But something inside me shifted that morning. The anger didn't feel so heavy anymore. Instead, it hardened into resolve, like steel cooling after a forge. I stood, straightened my back, and studied the room as if it were a map. The cracked window, the loose floorboard near the bed, the vent in the corner that hissed faintly, all of it spoke to me. I'd built this house. I knew its weaknesses better than any thief could. And if anyone was going to steal something from this place, it'd be me. That evening, Lowell came in, tossing a newspaper on the floor. "Read it if you want. Keeps your brain from rotting." He smirked, expecting a glare. Instead, I bent down, picked it up, and thanked him sweetly, like a hotel guest thanking the bellboy. Then I held the paper up, squinting, and declared, "Ah, good news. The crossword still isn't as difficult as your cooking." Claire snorted so loudly from the hallway that Lowell barked her name like a dog's. That alone made me grin wide enough to ache. But behind the comedy, my thoughts were racing. I traced the columns of the newspaper, not reading the stories, but remembering my lawyer's office downtown, the safe deposit box under my name, the documents tucked away with more power than any lock or key. 4 days in a cell had taught me patience. Now, I only needed timing. I looked at Rufus and whispered, "When the curtain lifts, it won't just be an exit, it'll be a vanishing act for the ages." Because soon, Lowell would learn that you can cage an old man, but you can't cage the years of wisdom, cunning, and humor he carries in his bones. On the 8th day, though, truth be told, I'd lost count of time. I realized something strange. I was no longer waiting for Lowell to open the door. In fact, the thought of him barging in, waving his smug face around, irritated me more than the hunger. No, what I wanted now was silence, pure silence, because in that quiet, I felt more alive than I had in years. I spent the morning conducting what I called the Great Escape rehearsal. I paced the floor, arms spread like I was giving a lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced to Rufus, who remained a most ungrateful audience. You are witnessing history. A man once locked up like a broom in the closet now walks free, not through rage, but through brilliance. I bowed so low I nearly tipped over, and my hip gave a protesting crack. I grimaced, then muttered, Note to self, bowing should be optional in old age. But then came the sting. I sat on the bed, clutching my knees, and the comedy drained for a moment. I thought of Ruth again, how she used to hum while cooking, her voice softer than the radio she always kept on. She would never have allowed this. Never. She would have stood toe to toe with Lowell, broom in hand, daring him to try such a thing. And yet, she wasn't here, and I was left to fight this battle alone. That thought hollowed me out, left me raw. Still, that rawness gave me power. I realized that when I finally walked out of this room, I wouldn't be walking back into my old life. That was gone. Lowell had made sure of that. But maybe, just maybe, that was a gift in disguise. I would leave this place, not as a defeated father, but as a man reborn. I looked at Rufus and grinned through my tears. Pack your bags, old friend. We're moving on. Because the truest revenge wouldn't just be escaping Lowell's cage, it would be living a life so free he'd never be able to catch the shadow of me again. The 9th day dawned with a strange kind of light, golden and sharp, like the world outside was trying to tempt me out. I pressed my face to the cracked window pane, breathing in the draft of cold autumn air that seeped through, and I swear it tasted like freedom itself. I muttered, That's the first decent meal I've had in days. That was the morning I decided the room wasn't a prison anymore, it was a theater, my stage, and if I was going to vanish, I'd do it with flair. I dragged the mattress across the floorboards, positioning it under the window, then climbed onto it with all the grace of a walrus. The frame groaned beneath me, and Rufus nearly tipped over from the dresser, watching me like a scandalized critic. Don't worry, Rufus, I panted. I'm not escaping yet, just checking the props. In the silence, a memory struck me so hard I had to sit back down. It was Lowell at 16, stomping out of the house after we'd argued about curfews. He'd shouted, You don't own me! And slammed the door. And now, decades later, here he was, trying to own me entirely. My chest ached with the bitter irony. Parents raise children to be free, but sometimes they grow into tyrants instead. Still, humor saved me. That evening, when Lowell slid in a plate of something unrecognizable, mashed potatoes maybe, or glue, I held it up to the light and said, Ah, the chef's special, mystery slop à la carte. Claire burst out laughing in the hallway, and Lowell cursed under his breath. I bowed grandly toward the door and announced, Thank you, thank you. I'll be here all week against my will. But inside, my heart had steadied into iron. I wasn't going to wait much longer. My plan was ready, my spirit sharpened. I was no longer a prisoner rehearsing freedom. I was a man with one last act left in him, one that would leave Lowell stumbling in the ruins of his own arrogance. Because soon, the door would open, and when it did, I wouldn't just walk out. I would erase myself so completely, my son would spend the rest of his life chasing a ghost. By the 10th night, my body was brittle, but my mind was blazing like a lantern. I lay awake listening to the house, breathe pipes sighing, beams shifting, the faint squeak of Claire's slippers as she padded across the kitchen floor. Funny, I thought, how a house tells on its occupants. Lowell stomped, like he wanted the walls to fear him. Claire moved, like she was forever apologizing for existing. And me? I was the ghost, waiting for my cue to leave. I started speaking to the shadows as if they were my old poker buddies. Gentlemen, I said, lifting an invisible glass. Tonight's wager isn't money, it's freedom, and I've got a royal flush hidden up my sleeve. I cackled so loudly Rufus almost slid off the dresser. That laugh echoed, bouncing off the walls. And I realized maybe for the first time that I wasn't broken. I was rehearsing joy. But then, like a thief, grief crept in. I remembered Ruth's hands, soft yet calloused from gardening, setting a plate of warm cornbread in front of me after a long day. She'd tilt her head and say, "Eat, Eldridge. You look like you've been fighting the world." And I had, always fighting for the mortgage, for Lowell's schooling, for the dignity of this family. And now my son had turned me into an inmate. My throat tightened. I whispered, "Ruth, I kept my promise. I built the life. But now, I think it's time to burn the script." The comedy returned in a rush. I picked up Lowell's dirty sock from the floor, bowed to Rufus, and declared, "Tonight's curtain call features the sock puppet of justice." I stuck the sock over my hand and made it say, in a ridiculous voice, "Gee whiz, Dad, I'm sorry I locked you up. Please forgive me." I laughed so hard I nearly choked, then whispered through tears, "If only the real one had that much sense." And there, in that mix of laughter and sorrow, my decision crystallized. I would leave, not out of bitterness, but out of theater. Lowell thought he'd written me out of his life. He had no idea I was about to rewrite the whole story, because when the lights came up on my final act, he wouldn't just lose me, he'd lose the very house he thought was his kingdom. By the 11th day, something peculiar happened. I stopped pacing like a caged animal and began walking like a man rehearsing a farewell tour. Every creak of the floorboards felt like applause, every groan of the pipes like an encore. Even my own reflection in the cracked dresser mirror looked less like a prisoner and more like a showman preparing his greatest trick. That morning, I spotted a pencil under the bed, long forgotten. I plucked it up like a relic from an archaeological dig and laughed. "Well, Rufus, looks like the universe just gave us our wand." I began scribbling on the back of the old newspaper Lowell had tossed in. Not words, plans, doodles of maps, arrows, even a cartoon of myself in a cape flying away from the house while Lowell stood shaking his fist below. The ridiculousness of it made me laugh until tears burned my eyes. But after the laughter, the ache came back heavier. I thought about all the times I'd told Lowell stories at bedtime, tales of knights, explorers, and outlaws who lived by their own code. He used to hang on every word, wide-eyed, asking, "Did they really escape, Dad?" And I'd always answer, "Of course they did. Brave men always find a way." Now he was the jailer, and I was the outlaw. The bitter twist of it nearly broke me. Still, comedy rescued me again. At lunch, Lowell shoved in a plate of macaroni, so overcooked it looked like paste. I lifted a forkful to Rufus and said solemnly, "Your Highness, today's banquet is glue à la mode. Bon appétit." Then I pretended to faint dramatically onto the bed, one hand clutching my chest like a stage actor. Through the door, I heard Claire giggling uncontrollably until Lowell barked, "Shut up!" That tiny rebellion of hers felt like a secret ally. But I wasn't fooling myself, my time was running out. The act couldn't last forever. The papers were waiting in the safe deposit box, the deed ready to be signed, and my escape itching in my bones. I whispered to Rufus, "When I vanish, it won't just be from this room. I'll vanish from their lives. And by the time they realize what happened, I'll already be gone with the very walls they took for granted." Because my revenge wasn't going to be loud, it was going to be quiet, elegant, and irreversible. By the 12th day, my body was thinner, my cheeks hollowed, but my spirit had grown strangely fat, with purpose. I didn't shuffle anymore. I strutted around that little room like it was a Broadway stage. I had even given titles to my performances: Breakfast with Betrayal, Lunch with Low Expectations, and the evening show The Great Escape, featuring Rufus the Duck. That morning, I tore the newspaper into strips and folded them into paper airplanes. Each one carried a message: freedom or bust. This prison serves terrible coffee. Lowell smells like cabbage. I launched them toward the window crack, and most of them nose-dived onto the floor. But the act of sending anything out into the world filled me with a strange joy. When the last one glided neatly under the dresser, I bowed low and announced, "And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes today's matinee." Yet after the laughter came the weight. I sat on the bed, the silence thick around me, and thought of Ruth again. I remembered her humming while planting tulips in the front yard, her hands covered in soil, her hair lit by the sunday. She used to say, This house isn't wood and nails, Eldridge. It's our story. And now Lowell had tried to turn that story into a cage. The cruelty of it dug into me deeper than hunger ever could. But cruelty has a way of sharpening the wit. That evening, Lowell pushed in a plate of spaghetti so tangled it looked like a bird's nest. I twirled the fork dramatically, raised it like a sword, and declared, "Behold, Excalibur, the pasta that will set me free!" Claire burst out laughing in the hall until Lowell slammed the door, red-faced. I savored that moment more than the food. Inside, my decision was final. Tomorrow or the day after, depending on when the lock clicked, I would step out, not as a beaten father, but as a man who had planned his departure to the last detail. My revenge wouldn't be shouting, or fists, or bitterness. It would be vanishing so completely, taking the very ground beneath their feet, that they'd never recover from the silence I left behind. Because sometimes the loudest revenge isn't what you say, it's what you take with you when you go. When the door clicked open that morning, I didn't rush. I took my time brushing the dust from the dresser, straightening Ruth's old handkerchief, smoothing the thin blanket until its corner made a neat triangle like a flag. Lowell stood there, arms crossed, expecting a grovel or a feeble apology. Claire hovered behind him, eyes bright with the small, guilty curiosity that had always made her soft around me. They both looked at me as if I were a puzzle they could solve by force. I rose slowly and met Lowell's gaze. My voice was steady, the kind that comes from sleep finally untroubled. "Lowell," I said, "you locked me up to teach me manners. You forgot one thing: manners are no substitute for legal paperwork." His face tightened as if I'd thrown cold water on his shoes. "What are you on about, Dad?" he barked. I walked to the desk, opened the top drawer where I'd kept the little things Ruth liked, the spare buttons, the letters, and from the back pocket of an old suit, I pulled a slim envelope. It had my name on it and a neat stamp from Marlowe and Amp. Finch, the lawyer who had once argued wills in a courthouse I used to pace with Ruth on rainy afternoons. I unsealed it with the flair of a man who'd been saving this tiny drama for the right act. Inside were the originals. The deed stamped with my name as a life tenant, the transfer forms already signed and notarized months ago, the instructions for my safe deposit box downtown, everything. Arranged the day. Ruth and I had laughed over too much coffee and said, "If anything happens to one of us, let the other have his fun." I'd set a clause in the papers that, after my death or written renunciation, the property would pass, as I directed. I'd never spoken of it because secrets are like stories, you save them for when they'll do the most good. Lowell's mouth opened, then shut. Confusion painted his face. You can't just... He stopped because he was suddenly aware of cameras on the porch. Etta from next door, bless her, who liked to garden and gossip in equal measure, had been there that morning and had the habit of waving a camera like it was a flag of honor. Claire's cheeks flushed. I smiled without bitterness. "Watch carefully," I said. I explained, slowly, almost politely. The house title was in my name as a life estate. The paperwork had been in the safe deposit box. I'd authorized Marlowe to transfer ownership if I ever decided to give it away or sell. I'd done it not to punish, but because I remembered the look on Lowell's face at 22 when he'd realized the world owed him nothing. I'd wanted to teach a lesson in an immutable language law, so I sold it, I said simply, to people who will care for it, to people who like this old place and will keep Ruth's tulips. The proceeds? I withdrew a little nest egg and bought a one-way ticket. Silence pressed in. Lowell's face crystallized into something raw, anger, disbelief, something close to grief. He lunged for the envelope, but Claire held him back with fingers that trembled. "You sold it?" she whispered, as if to herself. I nodded. "I did. I put the money where it would be safe and where it wouldn't be used to bind me. I kept a copy of the transfer in my mailbox, and I emptied the safe deposit box last week while you two argued about paint colors in the living room." I watched as comprehension dawned over Lowell like the slow light of a winter morning. He stumbled outside, calling the real estate agent's name, cursing the world. Etta, bless her, let out a long, delighted sound like someone who'd witnessed the best neighborhood drama since the Johnson's goat incident. Claire sank to the stair, covering her face with her hands, a small, helpless sound escaping her lips. In that moment, I felt something both dark and oddly tender. Pity. Not for myself, but for the boy who had learned to measure love with ledgers. I should have felt triumphant and cold, but what rose in me was a deep, clear joy. There is a particular happiness that comes from taking back your story. I'd taken mine and put it on a boat, sent it across an ocean, and lit a new match. I told them, gently, that I was leaving the next day, that I'd bought a small place by the sea in a town where nobody knew Lowell's name. You'll never find me, I added with a twinkle, because what's revenge without a little theater? Lowell's shout echoed half threat, half apology, but it had no power where the law had placed its stamp. Before I walked out that afternoon, I did a few small, ridiculous things, because old habits and humor die hard. I tucked the ceramic duck into my coat pocket. Rufus would have been scandalized otherwise. I folded Lowell's gym socks into a neat square and placed them atop the mantel like an offering to fate, and I left a note on the kitchen table in my best wavering handwriting. Keep the kettle clean, also buy better coffee. I smiled to myself at the absurdity of giving instructions even as I departed. Claire called after me in a voice that trembled. Dad, are you angry? I turned on the porch and met her eyes. No, I said, feeling warmth spread in my chest like good sunlight. I am free. I tipped an imaginary hat and carried Rufus out to the porch, where Etta clapped like an audience member delighted at the final bow. I didn't go to the airport that night. I walked to the little diner on the corner, ate a bowl of chili that made my eyes water, and listened to two young men argue about music that sounded like noise to me. I felt oddly young. Then I took a bus out of town with nothing but a small suitcase, a wad of paperwork proving my choices, and that ceramic duck who, by the time we reached the bus station, had a smudge of chili on his beak. I laughed until a woman across the aisle shook her head and said, You're a character, sir. I nodded. Been practicing my whole life. The plane rose the next morning, and as the town shrank into a patchwork quilt below, I thought of Lowell standing at the kitchen window, palms pressed to the glass, watching the place he'd thought he owned recede. I thought of Ruth's hands in the soil, and smiled because I had kept my promise to live on my own terms. I'd sold a house, yes, but I'd bought back myself. Years from now, perhaps, Lowell will tell the story differently, maybe with anger, maybe with a softer kind of shame. But for me, every morning since has been a small, private triumph. Waking to the gulls, making coffee that doesn't taste like defeat, and sitting on a balcony where the sea hushes the noise of petty kingdoms. I write letters sometimes, but I do not sign them with my old name and address. I send postcards with pictures of a shoreline and, on the back, one line, Life is for living. Learn it while you can. Rufus sits on the windowsill in this new room, chin dusty with salt air, and when I look at him, I still hear the creak of that old bedroom door. I chuckle, tuck him under my arm, and step out into a day that belongs to me. The lock is a memory now, a sound that taught me how to open every other door. Thank you for listening to my story. Write in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I always enjoy reading your answers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of betrayal, revenge, and dignity regained.